right? You should be able to see it, right? Right? Um, okay, good.
Yep.
Okay, so I'll just get into my stuff. All right. So the purpose of the workshop, which I'm going to give, is basically to not leave you on the ice, as we say, when you see, like, when an impromptu debate is happening. So that you are not shocked that you are seeing emotion, that you have only a limited time to prepare for it. After this workshop, I hope you will feel confident in like to know what you are supposed to do, what is expected of you, and you're confident in the steps you're going to take when you see an impromptu motion and you know how to prepare for it, right? I encourage that during the course of whatever I'm saying, uh, like please come up with questions if you have any. Try to think of some if you want some specific tips or have questions rising up. Just text them in chat. I will be able to see them while I'm speaking, and I'll be sure to answer them on the spot. All right, so let's get into it. Impromptu debating. The first question you have to ask that is obvious is like, what do you do when you see a motion, right? So you're in a tournament and then you are given a motion. What should you do? How do you start preparing for the debate right away? So the main question is, well, right, the main question is, how does it look like? Just ask yourself this particular question. Now, to answer this question is the answer is gonna depend on the type of motion. Broadly speaking, there are two types of motions that are relevant in the way you answer this question. One, let's call them, one would be closed to interpretation and the other would be open to interpretation. Or you could also say that one is practical heavy motion, other is perhaps more principle or philosophical type of motion. So here I have wrote down these two types, like an examples of these two types of motions. One would be, let's say, this house would prioritize giving agricultural subsidies to small local farms rather than large farming conglomerates. The other one would be this house believes that everything can be forgiven, right? So the first motion would be an example of one that is pretty much closed to interpretation, which is mechanism heavy motion that like who wins the debate basically is decided on who has the best argument for their policies. So proposition would win by proving that, you know, changing the way subsidies go to small local farms, and opposition would win by proving it otherwise, or that and they could do it in different ways, of course, right? That it would create more harm than good, or that giving them to large farming conglomerates is actually good, right? So how does it look like in this particular motion? What you should always do when you see a motion in a tournament and it's impromptu, like underline with your, you should write the motion on your paper, right? And then underline the words which sort of the key words of the motion. So for example, in this case, it would probably be, well, one is prioritize, obviously. Wait, maybe I can call it right. About prioritize. Um, then it would be small local farms, large farming conglomerates, and perhaps maybe like agriculture subsidies could be up to some sort of framing definition as well, right? So in this case, you see this motion, you underline these words, and you should have an idea about what do these words mean, or you can even write it out, right? So how would you define as proposition small local farms? How do they look like? How do they operate? What is the key characteristics that are that belong to small local farms that do not belong to large farming conglomerates. What's the difference? How does it look like, right? Then you would also do the same for large farming conglomerates. So if you're a prop, obviously you're gonna have to have like a negative framing of them, right? You are taking issue with the fact that they are getting the subsidies right now. So usually you would try to look at it from a negative way. I'm sorry, I have to let out the cat out of my room real quick. Right. Um, I apologize. Right. So you define how does it look like, and then prioritize is of course like the model that you would bring to the debate, the mechanism of action. How does this prioritization look like? And then in general, you should also ask for the whole motion. So when you see this type of motion, I mean, it should be intuitively obvious to you that what you're trying to claim is that local farms are good, large farming conglomerates are bad, right? So how does it look like? The question, if you're prop, you will try to answer it in a way of like emphasizing the positive characteristics of small local farms and the negative characteristics of large farming conglomerates, right? From opposition, of course, it's the opposite. Yes, so that is for the first type of motion that's closed interpretation. I mean, because it's only like it's clear what the line is going to be, more or less. Just what is unclear given the motion is how does the world look like. That's up to you to define, right? Then there comes the second type of motion, which we will call open to interpretation. This house believes that everything can be forgiven. Now, in such a motion, if you see something like this, um, there are a few different angles which you can take, right? So I'll go through the few different angles. Because this is like this house believes that motion, usually it means it's philosophical. It's based on principle. It's based more on abstract ideas which you're going to try to prove rather than the actual like actions which people are going to take or the government is going to take. However, this is not also necessarily like a rule that you have to follow 100%. Let's say that in such a motion, this house believes that everything can be forgiven. You may also frame or give an argument from the point of view of why holding this view as an individual, let's say, actually practicing this, like actually practicing forgiveness, right, would also create benefits for society, or would benefit you as an individual, your emotional well-being, or your life journey, let's say, right? So in this sort of case, the question of how does it look like may have many different answers, right? And usually the way it's going to go is that you're going to see this type of motion and probably you're going to have like one or two ideas about what you want to say about it. Like probably you're already coming up with something, right? And then usually the question of how does it look like will arise later on during your preparation time when you're already sort of have an idea of what you want to say because this is the ideas that you got as a team, and then that question is answered naturally later on because because it's more open to interpretation and because um, it may have many different answers, right? Now I wrote down here op is harder for novices in such motions. The reason I wrote this is because there are many different answers, whether or not you want to a principle lens and you just want to prove the concept that everything can be forgiven, or maybe propositions arguments are actually more hinged on, let's say, the individual's mental health if they hold this belief, and then societal benefits when holding this belief, right? From opposition, you're not gonna know, right? When you're preparing, you don't actually know what they're going to say, because it has the motion is open to interpretation. This means that um, you don't know how the debate also is going to look like, right? Because if we look at the first motion, just from the motion, we can know what the debate is going to look like, right? It's understandable. Proposition will defend small local farms. Opposition is going to defend large farming conglomerates. Most likely that's how it's going to go down, right? And the second type of motion, proposition will know what the frame they're going to bring, right? They're writing their own case. Opposition does not know what prop is going to say, and it may be different, right? It may be different from the ideas that they have of what proposition might say. In such a case, it then becomes like you really have to come up with more ideas of how you may interact with the framing of proposition. So let's say from opposition, you want to prioritize heavily the principal aspect of such a motion, and you may want to prove on philosophical and moral grounds why not everything can be forgiven, right? And if you have such a case, and then suddenly proposition is bringing you practical arguments within this motion, then you have to be smart about it and try to argue from the point of view, well, wait a second, let's look at the motion, let's read what it actually says. Whether or not everything can be forgiven in the first place, right, is dependent on the question itself, whether it can be forgiven or not. And if they cannot answer this question, then they cannot even have the practical arguments, right? You take this, you have to attack their framing. Then the debate becomes about the framing also, right? So these sort of decisions are going to come up more so during the actual debate, although you should keep them in mind during prep time. What you might say if they take a more principled approach, what you might say if they take a more practical approach, right? So as I say, this is like quite difficult, especially for beginners. I still want to point this out, right? Because this is how it actually goes down during debates, right? So, I mean, for now, it's not necessary for you to be constantly thinking of, oh, wait a minute, what's the strategy? What are they going to say? What are the different types of lines which they can take? It's good enough that you prepare a case and and try to attack them on their grounds, right? However, the debates might shake down in a way where it depends on what the framing was by either proposition or opposition. Right? Am I have I lost any of you? Is this like understandable? Should I go over this again in sort of different ways? Or is this clear? Because I'll move on if it's clear. Okay. So there's probably no questions. Okay. Then let's go into the preparation time. I mean, just to sum up again, real quick. What you do first is ask the question, how does it look like? This means, how would you define the words, basically? What is the question that is asked by the motion? You could also say it like that. And then there are two broad motion types, one in which this is going to be clear and you only need to define the concrete agents, concrete actors which are acting, and etc. And then the second type is that's more open to interpretation, and then how does it look like comes from the ideas that you generate, and you answer that question sort of retroactively. So you sort of come up with the arguments, and then you create the issue, essentially, the arguments are trying to solve. Okay. Then moving into the preparation time. So here I wrote down what is an ideal preparation time. It's not always going to go down like this, but generally you should try to follow this sort of structure. And if you follow this sort of structure, you should be successful in preparing for impromptu debates. The first thing that you do is 5 minutes of individual brainstorm. What this means is that you see the motion, right? And on your every member of the team on their own write down as many ideas that they may have which pertain to the motion. Just write everything that you're thinking about. Of course, you try to also answer this question, how does this look like? but you're also sort of trying to generate potential ideas for arguments. After those 5 minutes pass, and I generally also encourage you to use a timer on your phone to like try to follow the structure. That's what we did when we were beginning in debates. Not even begin. That's what we always did, right? And we always do. Even WSTC teams, right, do this. They just have a stopwatch, so they know that okay, the individual brainstorm has now passed. Even if I might come up with more ideas, we shouldn't waste any more time on that. Then goes 5 minutes of general discussion. So you try to share the ideas between each other. Usually it's going to be like some ideas repeat because they're good ideas, probably. That's why they repeat. And some ideas might not repeat, and you might want to develop them further. So some member of the team has an idea which the others did not, then it would be probably good for the other teammates to ask questions or to try to develop it real quick. And at the end of these 5 minutes, so after 10 minutes of preparation, the product of these 10 minutes, what you should usually have is a general outline of the case which you are building. So probably all of you already know how a case looks like, right? Here, the frame, the model, the case split, and then the arguments, right? So you should have this sort of outline ready after those 10 minutes, usually, right? I mean, that's why I say it's ideal prep time, because even for us, even for for the WSEC times, it would go like, okay, we have the general outline, but we only have the first two arguments. And then someone says, okay, but the third argument, the second speaker is going to write themselves at some point, probably, let's hope, right? So this may not be like this. However, I mean, the first two arguments you should have. I mean, those are important because they're the first speaker is going to present them, right? Right. So after those 10 minutes, you should have not the whole arguments fully developed, of course, but in general, like the links that you are going to build while you're writing the case. What I mean by that is you should probably have an idea of what the first argument is about, what is the general idea. From that, you will get a thesis. And then you should also have some perhaps examples, mechanisms, or some sort of analysis of why the thing that you are saying is true, why the thing that you're saying is important, and of course, what is the impact of the argument? Like, what does it mean to the case strategically? So these questions at the end of 10 minutes, like, should be more or less answered. I mean, not answered fully, but you should know what the answers might look like in your case. Right. Then it would be, after that, you would spend 30 minutes, pretty much the majority and the rest of the preparation time, to write the case. Now, I wrote down here that what the process actually looks like depends heavily on the team dynamic. And this is true. I mean, there is no set formula criteria of how these 30 minutes of case writing actually looks like, because it depends on the people who are in the team. So I don't know, from my experience, when I was like more intermediate debater, I was usually the member of the team that would generate most ideas about what arguments should be. So what it was usually like is that we would sort of generate the case, and then I, as the third speaker, would more or less dictate the first two arguments, like fully to the first speaker, and they would write them all out on their own paper as I was dictating, and the second speaker would usually write out their own arguments. I mean, but the issue with this is that the first and third speaker then may not know exactly what the third argument is about, right? And to solve this problem, then you would have to discuss it more so in the maybe last 5 minutes, or after you've finished writing out the first two arguments, that the second speaker would explain to you the third argument. Because during prep time, you should still be sort of communicating, or like during the 30 minutes of writing the case, you should still be communicating, or at least you should have some time set aside in which you can basically go through your whole case quickly, point by point, so that everyone is on the know, everyone is on the level, everyone understands what the main strategy and arguments are for the motion, right? And that's really crucial and important, because sometimes you, during like the 5 minutes of discussion, you may think that you've stated your idea clearly and that both your teammates know that, okay, in the second argument, there should be this impact. However, it sort of gets lost a little bit in the prep and in building the case. Someone forgot about it, like didn't write it out, and then you lose an impact because of that. Or you are the third speaker, and then you suddenly think that you're gonna bring up this impact during your clash points, but suddenly you realize that none of your speakers mentioned this, right? So to avoid these problems, you should still like ask each other questions during prep time, right? So let's say someone is writing out the first argument and they are writing it for themselves. Let's say they're the first speaker and they're writing out the first argument and they know exactly what it is. They might then be writing it, and then they're coming to this point of why true, and they have already from the brainstorm like 1 or 2 points written down, and then they say, okay, guys, listen up. I have these 2 points. Is that all we have, right? You know. So this is how an example of how communication would look like, and that's also what you should. As I said, there's no general structure or rule to follow because it's going to depend on the roles that you have as teammates. However, you should always still communicate. You don't write your own argument, right? You're building a case as a team, and all of the speeches are connected to each other, right? Because the second speaker is going to have to rebuild what the first speaker said, right? The third speaker, of course, is going to create all the clash points for all of the material. So everybody should know what the case is about, right? And how it is being developed. And that's a really important thing to remember. Right. Okay, then after these 30 minutes, so this one is the one that is most, how to say, I wouldn't say it's like least important, but it's the one that's most likely to get lost because you might not, the 30 minutes might not be enough to fully write out your case, right? So, and this does happen a lot. Or it might be like the general discussion sort of gets extended a little bit and you lose time of writing the case because you don't have really, really clear ideas, or you have some conflicting ideas in the team. And then the discussion tends to go on longer. Then you might lose the last 5 minutes for recuperating that, right? For recuperating the entire case. But so this might not be 5 minutes, this might be 2 minutes or 1 minute. But this is like the one that should usually be cut if you're losing out of time, right? If the discussion is really important, you can spend a little more time on 5 minutes. But also what's most important is to write out the full case. There is an angle here for opposition to attack us, because this point might not be so strong, right? Or you yourself are coming up, like you're writing out an argument, right? But as you're writing it out, you suddenly come up with a rebuttal to that argument, which would completely destroy that argument, right? And then it would be like, oh, wait a second, but how do we respond if the opponents bring this rebuttal? And why, like, this is the question that's left at the end, right? If this comes up, like if you're writing an argument and suddenly you think of a rebuttal that would destroy that argument, don't stop writing that argument and go into panic mode and start asking all your teammates, oh, wait a minute, but what if they say this? Then our argument doesn't work. No, no, no. You should not think like this. You should still continue writing out that argument and then leave that question for later because they might not even say it, right? But maybe you should still ask that question, but at the end of the preparation time, right? You should prioritize having your own case, but then if you see this line of rebuttal, you may also want to ask your teammates to try to do again a little bit of a brainstorm, generate some ideas of how would we how would we rebuild our case, or how would we respond to this rebuttal. Then you might also want to like clarify amongst yourself, okay, but what is the most impactful argument? Usually this is the sort of question that would be asked by the third speaker to the other two teammates who actually have their case and they're going to present it, right? Okay, but so in this case, we have three arguments. Which one is most impactful, right? And you should uh, have an answer for that usually, because it becomes clear after you've written the case. Oh, I see that in this argument we affect a lot of people and we prove it really, really well, that it has a huge impact. So it's probably this is the most impactful argument. So the first speaker may know that we should prioritize this. This wins us the debate more often than the other arguments, right? And then what is the most important for us to prove? Burden, right? Also, like, okay, what is the biggest question that needs to be answered by our case that could be challenged by opposition? What's the biggest question? So, for example, let's say in this motion, this house believes that everything can be forgiven. No, let's not take that one. It's too complicated. This house would prioritize giving agricultural subsidies to small local farms other than large farming conglomerates. So in this case, probably the burden, the largest burden, is to prove either like the negative aspects of large farming conglomerates, or to really, really prove the benefits of subsidizing small local farms, right? Um, that would be like an example of where the burden in the debate lies. If we were to look at this motion again, then it would like probably depend on the framing. So if your proposition is bringing a principle heavy motion, the main burden is just the motion itself answering this question, right? The burden is like being answered throughout the entire case. Every argument then is sort of answering the question of like why everything can in fact be forgiven, right? Even in the um, worst cases, right? And then last good one is like, okay, do we have any trap POIs? Which is, so you wrote out your case, and maybe you come up with like a really good POI, or like a good, you should like basically try to come up with good POIs. You shouldn't like it's not necessarily for prep time to also have POIs ready, but it's if you have a little time left over during preparation time, it's a good thing to also think about. Maybe we have any trap POIs. And what is trap POI? Like a trap POI is basically one that pigeonholes the opponents, which would like a POI that would be really difficult to answer, or a POI in which like there is a clear answer which is right. However, opposition, because they're defending something that's against that, they would like if they answer it, in the way that's obviously wrong, then they're principally consistent with their case. If their answer is like the right answer, then you can attack them. So this may be complicated sounding, but it's really not. Like, let's take a look at this motion. So let's say you um, characterize small farms as being like less polluting to nature, right? And large farming conglomerates as those which are like using up nature's resources and also polluting it at the same time. Then like a good POI to ask for opposition would be like, okay, would you rather give money to someone who, I don't know, let's say, who, like, let's say the question would be, would you think who is more deserving of praise? A caretaking mother who has a really positive impact on their children's lives, or a demanding and authoritarian father who creates who is abusive towards his children, right? Like this analogy. And what would they answer, right? They would have to answer like, of course, like we believe that mother in this fact is better, right? But then you say, okay, they answer this. Let's look at the reality of what is happening with small farms and large farming conglomerates. Large farming conglomerates are like the authoritarian father who creates physical harm because they're creating physical harm to our earth, which harms our health, harms the harms our basic livelihood, right? And small local farms are actually those who provide us with healthy, good food, and are also nurturing towards nature, right? So that would be like a TAPOI in this case. Okay. Is this part clear? Do maybe anybody has questions about the preparation process, or about the team dynamics, something like that? Okay, probably not. Right, so the case, I mean, okay, this is clear. This was a slide I was using for what I forgot to mention, I think, the frame, how you will, how you're also writing the case itself. So usually you would write out the outlines for the arguments, and then you would try to develop those arguments. Of course, the first priorities, the first two priorities are the model and the arguments. So of course, without the model, the arguments don't work. So you should, at the very first actions that you take, it should be like getting a clear model, the mechanism of action, what you're actually doing with the motion, what is the policy, or what is the idea that you're pushing. Then after that, you have the development of arguments. They don't necessarily need to have names instantly. So you may come up with their names for the case split later on. And then the framing and the introduction, even though they come first thing uh, when you're delivering the speech, they're usually going to be actually wrote down as the last thing when you're building the case. Because the frame usually becomes clearest after you've already developed your arguments. Because if you've already developed your arguments in a certain way, some frames might work, some might not, right? I think that's pretty intuitive. And the frame probably you, especially if you attended the previous workshops, you should know this. Like, okay, it's the sort of enlarged point of view of the case, like how the world looks like, what is the main issue, what are we doing to solve it, right? Okay. Then for the final part, I have these things which I wrote down as more advanced questions of preparation time. So these things, why I wrote down that they're more advanced, they're not really more complicated than any of the rest things that you are doing during preparation time. However, they usually just come to you, the understanding of how to answer these questions comes to you through practice. So after you've done a lot of debates, after you've attended a tournament or two, then you're more likely to know how you're going to answer these questions, right? After you've actually practiced debates. And these questions are, well, I wrote down two, which are probably generally most useful and important ways of building a case and arguments during preparation time. Like, which one do we think is gonna actually win us and take us to debate, right? And usually, this one is seen by if you understand which impacts are probably heaviest or affecting the largest scope of people, or it could be actually something different. You could actually say, let's say this motion, right? One of the ways of looking at this motion from another strategic point of view, rather than being like, as I said, being it closed interpretation is basically just mechanisms, is like, okay, what is the difference when government is giving subsidies to small businesses and large businesses? And you may come up with the idea that, oh, wait, when there are large businesses who are taking subsidies, they already, because of the nature of how large companies operate, oh yeah, it's a question. I'll answer it after I finish with this point about the question of strategy.
Also,
You,
very quickly, no?
uh-huh.
Could you explain what a subsidy is?
Yeah, subsidy is when the government gives money for something, basically. I mean, gives money to support business, right? That's what subsidies are. So you say, okay, what is the difference between large capital, big companies, and small companies? Oh, large capital already probably has some sort of political influence because they're big actors. They're like having a huge impact on the economy. Usually, they're gonna have made friends with politicians, etc., or they support certain political groups. And also, what oftentimes happens with these large capital owning companies and when they get subsidies from the government is corruption happens. Companies might compete not only on the market scale, but also compete on the different political groups that they support, the different political parties, and have connections with them, family ties, nepotism, etc., etc. And then they might, this sort of system also leads to systematically more corruption as opposed to giving it to small local farms, which simply do not have the political power, the capital as a group, right, to affect politics and affect policy, right? So, for example, you might then take a look at, okay, this is an argument that we have that is basically really hard for opposition to rebut, and also is probably an argument that they are not going to think we are bringing, right? Because it's sort of out of left field, because it's sort of different from what the motion actually implies the debate should be about. However, it's still within the bounds of the motion, and it would make sense to bring as an argument from proposition. I mean, I, as a judge, would not penalize this as being irrelevant. Right? So then you might say, okay, so because this argument, even though maybe it doesn't have the strongest impact, because the other arguments may have impacts about like food shortages or like also climate change, etc., etc. This argument is just standing more often than not. And even if it's like a really close debate, and we might think, okay, this is going to be a close debate, then this argument is important and we should prioritize it strategically, right? Would be sort of general strategy. Like how you would answer the